Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 52 and 53. Let's begin. Dr. Garaki was conscious of his breathing as he sat in his chair. He was looking at Izuku. The boy was sitting on a stool with his head bowed. He'd spent time earlier today stitching up the wound Izuku had made on his face. He'd applied some surgical tape and some glue of his own invention, so he was fairly sure it wouldn't scar. But Kurogiri expected him to speak to the boy. He was no psychologist. He had no idea why Izuku had felt the need to cut himself. Izuku, Dr. Garaki started. "It's my fault," the boy muttered. That was something. They had been afraid that Izuku might not talk. "What's your fault?" Kyudai asked, trying not to sound tired. "Dad." The single word wasn't that helpful as an answer. "What do you mean?" The doctor probed. "It's my fault the quirk didn't heal Dad." That explanation was more helpful, except it wasn't true and the doctor couldn't follow Izuku's reasoning. "Why do you think that?" Izuku looked up at him with wide eyes. The doctor could tell that the boy was wondering why he was even bothering to ask. But it wasn't that simple. He had no idea why Izuku believed it was his fault Hisashi was not healed. The boy gulped. "The quirk should have healed Dad, and it didn't. That means I still have a bit of it." The doctor understood the problem now. "No, you don't." He made the statement with force. Izuku's eyes went wider. The doctor didn't repeat anything. Despite the entreaty from the boy to repeat himself. "It healed Dad everywhere, except his head. Therefore I have to have a part of it still," Izuku explained further. "So I didn't have to stitch up that cut?" He didn't bother hold back on the sarcasm. At that, Izuku at least had the good taste to seem confused. "You do not have a part of the quirk, Izuku," the doctor reassured him. "Your quirk doesn't work like that," he added. "Once you start absorbing a quirk, you can no longer pass it on. So you cannot have a part of the quirk." "But, why didn't it work?" Izuku begged. "It did work," Kyudai told the boy. "It didn't." Izuku objected. "It worked, because your father is still alive," Dr. Garaki said mercilessly. That was not something any child wanted to hear, but it had the desired effect. Izuku stared at him, green eyes wide and shocked. The doctor sighed heavily. "Izuku, your father was alive before you gave him the quirk, but I will not lie, he was in a very bad way. You saw the damage." He waited for an acknowledgement and got a small nod. "The human body is not designed to deal with that much damage. Your father's brain was gone. The frontal lobe, the cerebral cortex, parietal lobe, occipital lobe and temporal lobes were gone. The only thing keeping your father's lungs working and his heart beating was his medulla." As he listed each brain part, Izuku's shade whitened. The doctor didn't think the boy understood what each part was, but he was intelligent enough to know that they were all necessary. And that says nothing about the skull, his eyes, nose and ears. Essentially, it means everything that made your father, his mind, was gone. Izuku gulped. "What does that mean?" He managed to ask. "It means that while I could keep your father alive, he wouldn't really be alive. His heart would beat, his lungs would work and eventually there would have been healing on the head wound, but he would never have woken up." It was maybe brutal to lay it out like that, but the doctor didn't believe in sugarcoating the truth. Whether it was sweet or bitter, the truth remained the truth. You giving him that quirk has meant that the parts of his brain that were destroyed have reformed. I have tested for brain activity and it is present, which means your father will wake up. When? Probably not for a few days. Despite the fact I prepared your father as much as possible, he was still exhausted, so it will take time for him to recover." Izuku said nothing in response to that and the doctor watched as he took several deep breaths. "It really helped Daddy?" he asked in a small voice. "It did, and do you know what will help your father more?" Kyudai huffed internally. He didn't sign up for child psychology. That was Kurogiri's job given that he was Tomura's keeper. And the misty bastard had dumped this on him. "What?" Izuku asked and there was a slight petulant edge to his voice. The doctor recognized that tone. It meant that Izuku would listen to him but probably wouldn't obey. And as much as Kyudai would like to blame Kurogiri, he knew they'd both have to answer to all for one if anything permanent happened to Izuku. "For nothing to happen to you," Dr. Garaki told him, looking deliberately at the cut on Izuku's cheek. It ran from just under his eye to the corner of his mouth. He'd stitched it up as carefully as he could, and applied surgical glue to help it heal, but the only reason Izuku wouldn't scar is because the glue contained a healing gel of his own design. Izuku just stared back. "It's important, Izuku. Can you promise me you won't hurt yourself again?" The boy said nothing. Dr. Garaki waited. He may not have signed up for child psychology, but he knew it was important for Izuku to answer him now. The doctor was glad of the glasses that covered his eyes as he sat there, waiting for an answer. Eventually, Izuku huffed. "I won't hurt myself," he said gently. Dr. Garaki was silent for a few moments as he took in Izuku's expression. "Good," he said finally. "Izuku, there are going to be changes, but your father will live now, and that means the worst of the trouble will be avoided." "If he wakes up," Izuku said stubbornly. "He will, Izuku," Kyudai replied immediately. "He will," he allowed himself to repeat. Given everything All for One had gone through, the doctor knew that he would awaken. The man that Hisashi was, would not allow anything less. Mirai held up the bag containing the little green scale. It was about as big as his thumb. Too large to have come off an animal. The forensic report confirmed that. It was a quirk scale. Except, of course, they couldn't say what quirk it came from. There were too many mutant and transformation quirks that caused scales, though the particular shade of green was striking. The report was on his desk. It stated that the scale was mostly made of keratin but had openings in it which the zoologist the forensic team had consulted felt could be filled in by harder substances, like bone, to make the scale even harder. The zoologist had an interest in herpetology and had indicated that, while she couldn't be sure, the scale looked to be young. However, whether that meant it came from a child or a teenager, or was just a newly grown scale was open to interpretation. The report stated that it was likely that the keratin scale grew, and as the scale matured, it would be filled in to make it better protection. That process hadn't started. And all of that was speculation. Mirai sighed, and shifted the bag, making the scale catch the light. Objectively it was pretty, but it was still an anomaly at the fight site. None of the emergency workers had a quirk that would cause them to have scales like that, and no one had reported missing anything. So this scale most likely belonged to the team who had picked up All for One. He should let it drop. The commissioner had told him that All for One's body was in a facility for study, but he was curious. Teams focused purely on research tended to overlook the quirks of their members. Or rather, they only focused on quirks if they were helpful. Otherwise, it was all about the brain. Mirai didn't subscribe to the theory that those with more animal-like quirks had a more animal-like intelligence, but some would, which was interesting that someone with a scale quirk could be on that team. Or they might only be on the team for brawn. Which meant the scale belonged to an adult, but was a newly formed one for them. A ping interrupted Sir Night-Eye's thoughts. An email. His email chimed in different tones to represent different things. Those on his contact list gave him a familiar, email-arrived tone. Those from people he didn't know gave a much more warning tone, but those from people not on his contact list but who were responding to an email he had previously sent gave another tone. It let him know that information was now available, even if the information was that they couldn't answer his questions. That's what usually happened. He lowered the bag and moved to his desk, placing it beside the mouse as he clicked to his email client. The email was tagged as coming from China. Mirai smiled. It was a long shot and he trusted the commissioner, but he was curious. There was one other possibility for the scale. It might have been produced by All for One. He did, after all, have a scale quirk stolen from a child in China. He clicked open. That's Hiru's scale. The opening statement gave credence to the theory that All for One had for some reason tried to use that scale quirk. Mirai frowned. Given the damage, was it possible that the quirks the man held went out of control? Only Toshinori would be able to answer that question, and Mirai rather thought that he hadn't been in the right frame of mind to notice such details. He took a deep breath and looked back at the message. The composition and shape are the same as Hiru's scales, though admittedly the color is different. See photo attached. What does this mean, Sir Night-Eye? While we are aware that copying quirks exist, they are only in a limited fashion. Are you indicating that someone can copy quirks permanently? The sidekick hid a wince at the question. That was getting a bit too close to the mark. Or are you suggesting something more exotic? That the person copying the quirk then suppresses the quirk in the original holder? That was a dangerous question, and it displayed their hope. They still had hope that Hiru's quirk would return. He knew it wouldn't. He'd told them as much. Their doctors had told them as much, but some people were never logical. Yet the question was inching towards the truth, that there was a quirk out in the world that could, not copy quirks, but take them away permanently. Except that quirk was no longer in the world. He had a feeling that knowledge wouldn't comfort Hiryu or his parents. He didn't bother to read the rest of the email. He'd have to reply to them, telling them that the scale had been found at the site of a villain fight, and while it may look like Hiru's, it was most likely from a villain. Whoever said the truth was always the best option had not dealt with delusional parents who held out hope where there was none. Mirai looked at the scale. What had All for One been thinking? "This is boring," Tomura announced. "How much longer is he going to be asleep?" The teenager growled the question. Usually, Kurogiri would have said something in an attempt to modulate Tomura's words, especially since he was referring to Sensei, but in this case he was curious as to the answer himself. All for One was lying on a comfortable bed, yet it was still obviously a hospital bed. The sheets were white and the upper section was partially raised. A tube went into his throat and there were several monitoring points over his body. A heart monitor beeped softly and there was a hiss from the respirator. Gigantomachia was standing in the shadows on the other side of the bed. The huge man was only moved when Izuku was present, and then it was usually to a position to better cover both the boy and his father. The top of Sensei's head was now formed, but it was a mass of scar tissue. The doctor assured them that the bone underneath was whole and that there was brain activity. Still, it was disconcerting to see the great man in such a state. He had no eyes, only a slight depression where they should be, and his nose was gone. "I am unsure, Tomura," the doctor replied. "Sensei is not in a coma. There is too much brain activity for that, but he is not merely asleep either. He is in a state of transition. So we must be patient," the doctor concluded. Tomura huffed. The only time Kurogiri had seen the teenager display patience was when playing some of his games. There were a few of them that required things done in real time. Tomura griped about them, but he did it, usually going to a secondary game while waiting. He did not do patience very well. There was a follow-up question Kurogiri needed to know but couldn't ask with the teen here. When All for One woke up, would he be the same? The misty man was almost afraid of the answer, but he had to know. They all had to know. "I'm sure he will wake up soon," the doctor said. "And probably demand at that." The doctor paused. "I'm not actually sure, but something," he added. The doctor caught Kurogiri's yellow eyes and gave a significant nod. The misty man raised his chin in acknowledgement. Though he would not accept the answer fully until Sensei was awake, and proven to be, well, he couldn't say whole, but at least in complete control of his faculties. And then Kurogiri resisted the urge to sigh. Then there would be a reckoning. Not with All Might, but with the rest of the underworld. All for One had not yet been gone for so long that there was rebellion, but Kurogiri wasn't naive enough to believe that news of his condition wasn't spreading. They had brought in too many healers for it not to. He knew there'd be a few groups who would test their emperor and they would have to be dealt with. That would probably be bloody, and the Misty Man hoped it wouldn't attract the attention of the heroes. Even with All Might most likely out of the picture, at least for the moment, they had enough problems. And right at the moment, as they continued to wait for Sensei to wake up, Kurogiri didn't see a lot of solutions. "Little dragon, do you want me to get your homework?" Izuku looked at the text from Ochako. At least she hadn't asked when he would be back at school because he didn't know. Kurogiri had said that he wouldn't be allowed back until his dad woke up, but the Misty Man admitted that he didn't know when that would be. And Kurogiri had warned him not to let people know where they were. He already knew that. He was 9 now, but he remembered the raid. With his dad out of commission, he did not want to go through that again. "Yes, please," Izuku replied. "Except I don't know when I'll be able to collect it." He added the statement. It was true. He didn't know when he would be able to get it. "I can bring it over," Ochako replied almost immediately. Izuku frowned at that. She didn't know where he lived. While they were great friends, Ochako hadn't come over to his current house, and with the kitchen floor the way it was, yeah, that couldn't happen. Sure, they could say it was a quirk accident, but then he'd probably have to give more of an explanation. Plus Kurogiri had told him it would be dangerous to go out, that there might be people looking for him. Maybe he shouldn't have accepted her offer to collect his homework. Izuku looked up from his phone towards the bed his dad was now lying in. It was a hospital bed, and the top was raised. He couldn't really see his dad well though because covering it was a large plastic bubble. Dr. Garaki had explained that it was a way of making sure his dad got enough air to breathe, though there was still a tube going into his throat. Izuku didn't like that bit. The sensors stuck all over his dad, and those on his head, he could understand. They were needed to monitor his condition, but the tube into his throat, that was just a reminder that nothing was right. I don't think you can, Izuku replied to his friend. Dad's having to stay in a sterile environment. At least, that's what the doctor said should be happening. Izuku, you said your dad was injured, but how injured was he? The response was immediate. He looked at the message. He could imagine the way Ochako would look. She'd been concerned, her eyes wide and worried. He was really badly injured. Izuku wrote back. We got in healers but he's not fully recovered yet. It's going to take a long time. Will you be out of school the entire time? That was a good question. Izuku didn't know. No one has said anything yet. He replied honestly. There was a pause before Ochako replied. I'm so sorry, Izuku. He wasn't entirely sure what she was sorry for, but he knew she meant well. It's not your fault, he told her. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't Kurogiri, or Tomura's, or Gigantamachi's fault. It was All Might's. It was that regeneration quirk's fault that his dad hadn't healed correctly. It was an odd thought. He'd never really thought about it before. His dad relied on quirks all the time. A lot of his dad's employees relied on them as well. Kurogiri definitely did. But Dr. Garaki didn't. Izuku wasn't even sure what the doctor's quirk was. Izuku looked down at his phone, but he wasn't really seeing the screen. He'd always been taught that you could rely on quirks, but could you? Heroes relied on their quirks. That's why they were heroes, but if you took that logic, then it was a quirk that had gotten them into this situation. If you couldn't rely on quirks, what could you rely on? Izuku frowned. He wasn't sure. Izuku, Kurogiri called him. Yes, Izuku replied. It's time for a check, the Misty Man told him. Izuku nodded. And put his phone away before he rose. He didn't know why he had to stay in this room. The room they'd given him to sleep in was close enough. He could have done this check from there and then he wouldn't have had to see his dad. He quashed the feeling of guilt that accompanied that thought. At least Gigantomachia was happy to have him here. The large man smiled but didn't move from his father's side. Izuku moved forward. His dad was lying on the bed. His hands were on the sheet beside him. It made him look almost peaceful, but then Izuku saw the tube in his throat, the sensors on his body, the needles going into his arms and neck, and the plastic that covered the bed. Then there were the sounds which told him that his dad just wasn't lying there. The pish hiss of the respirator. The beep, beep of the heart monitor. The whir of something he didn't know and the low-level hum of the other instruments. Izuku didn't like being here. But he felt guilty for that feeling. He should want to see his dad, but at the same time he didn't. Not like this. He moved forward so that he was standing beside the bed and raised one hand to touch the flexible plastic cover. He didn't really need to do any of that, but Garaki and Kurogiri seemed pleased when he did. Then he reached out to sense his dad's quirks. They were still tightly packed around the center. Izuku knew they weren't his father. He knew they were just quirks, but like Kurogiri and Garaki, he knew that because they were there, his father was there. Izuku reached out. He just wanted to feel them, to see if he could feel his dad. He didn't mean to touch them, but when his senses got close, one rose slightly. He brushed against it, not taking it, just touching it. Izuku flinched back. He wasn't fast enough. One of his father's hands, which had been resting on the sheet, shot out. The plastic covering, keeping the clean air in, ripped and Izuku felt his dad's hand on his face. Then he felt quirks being forced into him. It hurt. It wasn't like the other times his dad had given him a quirk. This hurt. Izuku screamed. He vaguely thought Kurogiri and Garaki were yelling, but he couldn't hear them. Instinctively he pushed back. Kali Imperium activated and pushed him away. It pushed the hospital bed his father was lying on into Gigantomachia. As soon as his dad's hand was off him, Izuku stumbled back before falling. He could feel the new quirks running riot in him. It hurt. Garaki didn't pay attention to him. The doctor ran forward to deal with his dad. He didn't get that close though. Instead, the doctor went to a control point and activated drugs. Sedatives flushed into Hisashi Midoriya's system and the man went still. He hadn't fallen. Gigantomachia had kept the bed stable. What happened? Kurogiri demanded. The misty man didn't get an answer. Izuku just moaned. He could feel the quirks his dad had forced into him. They squirmed. It almost felt like they were pushing against his skin. He tried to grab them, to bring them under control, but they simply slipped away. The doctor came over to Izuku and placed one hand on his forehead. "Is burning up," came the diagnosis. "Put him in the chair," came the follow-up instruction. Kurogiri obeyed, lifting Izuku and putting him in the chair that had been set up for the doctor to watch Hisashi's vital signs. Izuku squirmed in the chair. His limbs jerked and the misty man was hard-pressed to keep him there, though he too could now feel the burning of Izuku's skin. He was covered in sweat. The doctor pulled a syringe from his jacket pocket and a vial of some clear liquid from a different pocket. "Sedative," he explained, carefully measuring out a dose. The misty man nodded, and held out Izuku's arm. The doctor came over, and carefully pushed the needle into the offered flesh. "This one doesn't matter if it's intravenous or intramuscular," Garaki answered a question that wasn't asked. All that mattered at the moment was that the drug got into Izuku's system. Quickly, Izuku stilled and Kurogiri could release his grip. "What happened?" he demanded again. The doctor glared at him. Before he once again felt Izuku's forehead. "I don't know," he said finally. "You have a suspicion," the misty man returned with a growl. "I have a suspicion," Dr. Kyudai confirmed. The misty man gave the doctor his own glare. It said without words that the explanation better be forthcoming. "You know my experiments?" Garaki asked, rather than explaining. "Of course. Before they lose their minds, there's usually a fever from having too many quirks," the doctor reported in a monotone. Kurogiri felt his eyes widen. He wasn't sure what to say. "Except Izuku can handle multiple quirks," Kyudai continued. "But, I suspect Hisashi has dumped a lot into him as a sort of instinctive defense, and it will take time for Izuku to assimilate them all." "You believe he will be fine?" Kurogiri asked carefully, aware of the way Gigantomachia was listening in. Despite his bulk, it was often easy to forget he was there. Except right now there was a glint in his eyes that said the answer better be acceptable. "Yes." To the doctor's credit, his voice didn't waver in the slightest. "Since he's never gotten so many before, it has caused a shock to his system. He'll sleep it off." "You are sure about that?" The misty man didn't want to ask, but he realized he had to. "As sure as I can be without running tests," the doctor replied testily. He was running very short on sleep. "This is what happened in the past," he explained. "When we were first testing how many quirks a body could handle, this is usually what happened. The body runs a fever and then they don't wake up. Izuku will run a small fever, and then he will assimilate the quirks and wake up." The extra explanation was added before Kurogiri could object. The misty man didn't sigh. "You'd better be right," he instead muttered. The "for all our sakes" was not needed. The doctor already knew that. If Hisashi died, Gigantomachia would kill them. If Izuku died, Hisashi would kill them. Unless everything went right, someone would kill them. It was not an ideal situation, but they had to deal with the hand they had. All for One could not remember a time when he did not wake instantly. Given that he had been involved in a centuries-long war against the status quo, lying leisurely, half asleep, would not have been conducive to his lifespan. Even injured, even drugged, this didn't change. Hisashi did not move when he became conscious. Instead, he stretched his senses to determine his situation. The first thing he noticed was pain, but he pushed that aside. Then there was the sound of a ventilator. He could feel something on his throat, so knew it was hooked up to him, and there was a beeping coming from a heart monitor. He recognized the particular lethargy brought about by having drugs in his system and correlated that he was being treated. He couldn't smell anything, but there was the taste of antiseptic. With the drugs, he knew better than to attempt to use a quirk. There were also quirk monitors, so until he knew where he was, he would hold off on that, but he could feel them still. So he wasn't being subjected to quirk suppression. That meant he was with subordinates, or whoever had him didn't think there was a need. And there was someone here. He could hear them breathing to his left. The sound was even and relaxed. It was slow, so either they were fit or a large person. They hadn't reacted to his return to consciousness, so for the moment, satisfied that he wasn't in immediate danger, Hisashi turned his attention to his body. Being connected to a ventilator explained the scratchy feeling in his throat. It also explained the hiss of air he could hear and feel on his chin. The rest of his body felt surprisingly pain-free. Either the drugs were suppressing everything or... He cast his mind back over what had happened. Hisashi wasn't surprised when he couldn't exactly remember. Drugs would have that effect, but he persisted in probing his memory. A procession of days at work filled his mind. So, something had happened there. The impression of blue, yellow and red came through his thoughts for no reason. All for One knew what that meant, even as he strained for a more exact memory. One for all. That blonde buffoon. The thought triggered the memory. The moron had confronted him at work and there had been the inevitable fight. He should have been able to swat the holder of his brother's quirk aside. He had last time, but given what he could hear, the fight must have been more equal than he believed it would be. Hisashi resisted the urge to sigh. He couldn't feel any restraints, but there was no guarantee he was with his subordinates. It was best that whoever was in the corner breathing did not yet know he was awake. He went back to trying to remember the fight. The current holder of One for All Might had come through the door to his office, fists already raised to fight. He'd reacted instantly. Surprise was something to be pushed aside until the threat was dealt with. Destruction was to be expected. Then, the images were muddled. He remembered a fist. He remembered the smell of blood. The feel of resistance from air cannon. He knew he'd hit the hero. He knew he'd drilled through the hero. There had been no sigh, despite the blood fountaining over his costume and from his side. He'd continued forward. And then, All for One's self-control was not so weak that he winced at the memory, but internally he was disappointed. And then the so-called number one hero had punched him. Blood had been streaming from his side, there were intestines coming through the wound, but the blonde man had attacked, and all Hisashi could remember was the fist coming towards him with all the power stored in the quirk he had given to his brother directed at him. After that, his memory went black. He'd been injured. That conclusion was obvious. He was still injured given that he could feel a ventilator and hear a heart monitor. But where was he? Drugs interfered with his quirk control, but he needed to know. Carefully, Hisashi reached for his core. And noticed that there were quirks missing. He suppressed a growl at that and reached for the quirk that wouldn't abandon him. All for One. His quirk flared under his touch and he could feel quirks around him. The person breathing had more than one quirk. Hisashi released his hold on his quirk. He recognized those quirks. Gigantomachia. Which meant wherever he was, it was with his servants. It was safe to show he was awake. All for One focused on his face. The skin felt hot and stretched. He tried to open his eyes, but something was wrong. He could feel the muscles working, but the skin just pulled tight. The movement, slight though it was, caught Gigantomachia's attention. "Garaki," the huge man called. Hisashi lifted one hand as he heard the doctor move closer. The movement was harder than it should be. "Sensei," the doctor said. "Don't move," the man said. "You are on a ventilator," he added the unnecessary explanation. All for One managed to growl. He needed more information. "You were injured by All Might," the doctor continued. At least the man knew that he would want an explanation. "You have mostly healed, but there is extensive scarring." Damn, he ran out of air. "Damage?" Hisashi managed to force out the single word as a question. The memory of an empowered fist coming at him flashed through his mind again. "Head injury," the doctor told him matter-of-factly. The man sighed. "Extensive brain damage. Your skull was destroyed. Your brain was destroyed. The frontal and parietal lobes were gone." It took a few moments for All for One to think that through. Biology wasn't his strong point, but the follow-up question should have been obvious. If the damage was that bad, why was he waking up? He might not have expected to lose that fight, but All for One hadn't lived so long because he lied to himself. Even when injured. And he knew, healing quirks could only do so much. The type of healing quirks that could do more, they were with the government, and while he had the contacts to get access to them, they were his contacts, not the doctor's. "We got a regeneration quirk," Garaki explained, "but it wasn't perfect." It may not have been perfect, but if the damage was as bad as the doctor explained, then it had done its job. He flexed his fingers, forming fists. He was disassociating. Hisashi could hear that Garaki was thankful for that. Maybe it was the drugs. There would be rage, there would be grief. There would be every emotion. Later. It did not serve now. "Izuku?" He got the question out. If they had gotten a regeneration quirk, then it had to be through his son. Sleeping, Garaki told him quickly. Too quickly. Hisashi was immediately on guard again, but before he could force any further words out, he felt his consciousness slip back into darkness. End chapters 52 and 53, The Emperor's Dragon. Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.